Great. So I'm very excited to be here. This is a project I've been working on for a while, mostly focusing on the organizational side of it. How do you design organizations and roles, especially when people are getting scrutinized through social media? But given this audience, would love to know your thoughts on implications for this research for technology design for social media design too. So I have designed the talk for around 40 minutes. But would love anytime you have any questions, suggestions, please interrupt me. So getting more feedback is important. So with that said, let me start. So the focus of this talk is going to be on when people use social media to scrutinize frontline workers, frontline professionals, what kind of impact does it have? So that's sort of the broader focus. So let me kind of give some examples before I delve into the specific study. So we all know that social media have been used to scrutinize individuals, organizations, workers, right, on their what one would consider as bad practices oftentimes, and it had some impact. A lot of the conversation going on today on the role of social media largely focuses on free speech, right? Could anybody use social media for all kinds of things, or should there be some form of governance and censorship? And people talk about things such as cancel culture, right? Some argue that, that's not good. Cancel culture actually inhibits free speech. Others say there is nothing called cancel culture. Cancel culture is just accountability culture. People who are not held accountable for a long time, now you have a new tool to keep them accountable, right? So that's whole conversation going on in the popular press. I'm not going to really talk about that or deal with that in the main portion of the talk. Towards the end, I would. But my focus is mainly on people using social media, clients, general public using social media to scrutinize, criticize frontline workers who they interact with. So they had some problems with an interaction they had with a frontline worker. Think of a call center employee, or think of someone you met at an airline check-in counter, right? So they now can take video of them or criticize them, post them on social media. So what happens in those circumstances? So that's going to be broadly my focus. So why frontline professionals? Because oftentimes they are the ones who interact with the customers, with the general public. They act almost as this interface, right? They're representatives of an organization, but they interface with the outside world. And they also do important internal coordination, right? If someone complains, if I as a client complains that your service is not good, it's typically these frontline workers who kind of assign the category of that incident and perform some coordination internally, right? More broadly, but because they act as this interface, paradoxically, they're also typically the targets of social media scrutiny. If someone is unhappy, maybe it's some broader organizational policies that lets them say certain things, but it is that particular individual, that frontline worker, who gets called out, who gets scrutinized, right? So that's the phenomenon I'm going to talk about. And let me kind of give what do we know from current research on the impact of social media. Is it a good thing? Does it sort of improve processes, improve accountability, or does it produce different outcomes? And the results have been mixed. Actually, we don't have a good idea on, is it good, is it bad, does it produce better organizational policies, practices, or doesn't matter, right? So I'll give a couple of examples that shows that social media scrutiny could have a positive impact, right? You might remember this United Airlines incident where a passenger got forcefully pulled out because the flight was overbooked, right? And that particular video became really popular. A lot of people were complaining about United. So they actually took some positive changes, rechanged their overbooking policy, they compensated the person, but also many other changes that, at least in principle, makes the life of the customers easy, right? Another example is more recent one on Me Too in Hollywood, right? So there have been some empirical studies that documents that after the incident became really, a lot of people complained about Harvey Weinstein. The producers who used to be associated with Harvey Weinstein, they tended to hire more female writers. They wanted to increase representation of women in the industry. So it had produced some good outcomes. right? So this is on the one hand, social media scrutiny could improve accountability, could produce good outcomes. On the other hand, more recent work, including my own ongoing research, suggests that at certain other conditions, social media scrutiny could worsen accountability, could actually make things worse inside an organization. So this is a study on triage nurses during the COVID-19 pandemic. So when people go to the ER in a hospital, and if they're not unhappy, the triage nurse says, your thing, it doesn't look like a serious emergency, I got to assign you a certain priority level. They get very worked out. They take a video of that person, share it on social media. And in turn, what happened was those frontline workers, the triage nurses, became very risk averse, became very self-protective because the organization was not protecting them. So they would categorize many incidents, even very low priority medical issues, as emergencies, which in turn crowded the whole ER system, right? So these sort of studies suggest that there could be something else going on too. Social media scrutiny could actually make frontline workers very risk averse, could in turn impact accountability in negative ways. So this is what we know. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, is there a way to systematically understand it? What are the underlying mechanisms that goes on that actually improves versus worsens accountability? So that's the focus. Let me give some definitions. What do I mean by accountability, right? How members of a professional group, think of nurses, how do they monitor, evaluate, and enact some changes in response to the demands of various stakeholder groups, right? These could be clients, this could be the public, but this could also be other audiences like regulators, right? And there is, as you could know, increased demand for accountability. That's one of the most popular terms used in congressional reports, apart from transparency, is the word accountability, right? But we really don't know, does this demand for increasing accountability, does it actually produce more accountability? Could we impose it from the outside? Or should it be more of an organic felt accountability, right? We don't know. And especially when it comes to social media, the puzzle here, if we want to formalize this, on the one hand, social media scrutiny could improve accountability, the examples I showed, right? The Me Too in Hollywood. There is some evidence, suggestive evidence. On the other hand, it could also worsen accountability. So could we think of when and what conditions does this lead to improved accountability outcomes versus worsen accountability? And how does that in turn could impact us? It could what implications does it have for designing organizational roles, policies, but also the design of technology? So that's the focus. So my question, more broad question on how does social media scrutiny impact the accountability of frontline professionals, such as triage nurses, right? And with what organizational consequences? That's the question. Let me give a summary overview of my arguments, and then I'll talk about the specific case, highlight under what conditions that social media scrutiny could actually worsen accountability. So my argument essentially is there are certain conditions where scrutiny could improve accountability, and those are when there are pockets of private information that people individually know in circles, but that is still remain private, right? And when it is posted on social media, it just doesn't become public knowledge. It's not that there's some new information revealed, right? Think again of the Harvey Weinstein case. It's an open secret in Hollywood about Harvey Weinstein. It's not some new information that social media and investigative journalists uncovered. But the minute when there was social media scrutiny around that, then what happened was people who already know the information, they wanted to disassociate from Harvey Weinstein, from people like him, right? Which in turn triggered this whole set of internal processes that improved accountability. There were a lot more policies enacted within these production companies on, under what conditions we should escalate these issues and so forth. So the first mechanism that could lead to improved accountability is when this private information, or let's call it open secrets, become common knowledge. And common knowledge is a very specific kind of term. It is not this information available widespread. It means that everybody knows, that everybody else knows that this person is a problem, right? So that because everybody knows that everybody else also knows, Therefore, they try to disassociate at least, right? Or they try to at least publicly signal that they're doing something to address this. Yes.
Just to make sure I understand.
Yeah.
In your example,
Sure.
All right, so just to make sure I understand, in your example, all of the women in Hollywood, it was already in some sense common knowledge that Harvey Weinstein was doing this.
Yeah.
So is it about that it was common knowledge now to not just the people who are harmed? Like, what's the boundary that got crossed there?
Yeah. So it was not just the people who were harmed. It's not just the women who knew, right? There were others in the company who knew about it. But everybody thought only a few of them knew. And therefore, they don't need to take any public actions to signal what their stance is. But now it is common knowledge. It's essentially what it does is people know that others know, and they know that others know that I also know this issue, and therefore I have to do something. That's the essence of common knowledge. And therefore the others too, who are not related to this. For instance, a lot of producers who had prior ties with Harvey Weinstein, they actually try to disassociate and do a lot of visible changes in their own companies related to sexual harassment and the policies around. So that's the mechanism. From pockets of private information, open secret becomes common knowledge. And because of that, people try to resist. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I'm trying to understand the difference between an open secret and common knowledge.
Yeah.
Because open secret, everyone who was impacted already knew. But here it's actually, is it about the set of people who now know? It could be an open secret amongst the entire world now?
Yeah, essentially that, right? It becomes the act of some private information, pockets of private information becoming into the public, essentially means that I know that not just a few people know, many others know, and the many others know that I also possibly know about this issue. Mm-hmm. So there is no escape. I have to actually do something. Think of, say I'm a head of a production company, right? I have to sort of now say, I can't plead ignorance. So I think that is the mechanism. Private knowledge becomes common knowledge. Yeah, so I think that's the mechanism that could impact change. Whereas the other, when does it worsen accountability? The cases when scrutiny could disrupt the meaning of a phenomenon, right, or a definition of a meaning of a phenomenon. Think again the example I gave of the triage nurses. There are some definitions on what a serious medical emergency is and who should be admitted, who should be sent to a different ward, right? But when people jump in, say that my incident, you have to take it seriously, it's a real emergency, and if others also kind of pile on onto that, then it actually disrupts the definition on what a medical emergency is, who should be sent to an ER versus critical care versus some other unit. That in turn worsens accountability because the triage nurses are exposed and therefore they act very self-protective. For them, it's rational to categorize most incidents as emergencies, send them. Of course, it actually really constrains the system, right? There's a lot of resources that are logged in. But for them, they are not exposed anymore to social media, right? So that's the mechanism, essentially. When some private information becomes common knowledge, could potentially improve accountability. But when a similar incident, when it challenges the definitions, when others kind of pile on saying, why are you not considering this person's medical issue as an emergency, right? There is no kind of pushback against it. Therefore, a rational strategy for an individual is to categorize most things as according to this new definition that the people are. So that's sort of the argument. And the broader kind of theme I want to talk about is scrutiny, especially in the wake of social media, has become a kind of spectacle. And spectacles are not necessarily bad, right? Spectacles could actually, as I mentioned, could produce this common knowledge, produce some incidents that pockets of people know, it becomes much more widespread. But scrutiny could also disrupt commonly accepted definitions. And commonly accepted definitions, not necessarily bad, right? There are a lot of thought that went on to define what is a serious medical emergency versus not. And if everybody is challenging it publicly without the professionals, there's no recourse for them, it actually challenges. So that's sort of the broader argument. And I'll walk this through using one case on what happened that actually worsened accountability. So that's going to be that. Any questions on these two, on why this happened? What are some of the processes that drive this, especially on the second part? So that's going to be the rest of the talk. Any questions so far on the two mechanisms? Awesome. All right. So let me talk about the context. My context are emergency management organizations. These are 911. Think of them as call centers. They do more than that. So the job of these call centers, they attend 911 calls. If you dial 911, it's essentially a person, a frontline worker, call taker, who takes the call, who asks a set of questions, and decides to categorize whether your incident is a serious 911 emergency or not. So that's the context I'm going to talk about. Just an example. Most of these call takers are women, racialized minorities. And this is a specific strategic research site for me to understand these questions because a lot of issues around social media scrutiny happens. And you'd be surprised, I'll show some examples. People complain, people shout at these call takers saying, why are you not sending a cop? My neighbor is throwing a party. Or my apartment key is lost. So they shout about it. Sometimes they complain on social media. And again, you'd be surprised on the kind of things that goes viral, the kind of complaints, the nature of those complaints. So that's why I thought, okay, there's an opportunity for me to look at how people's behavior change, the call takers' behavior change, before and after a particular incident goes viral, a particular incident of scrutiny. So that's the context. Let me give some examples of social media scrutiny, largely on Twitter. People go to Twitter to complain. So you could read some. The first one on, my car got broken into. I called 911 to report this woman. And she asked me to file this to a local police station. Again, by protocol, by the organizational policy, if the perpetrator is not on the scene, there is no purpose sending an officer to the scene. So the protocol is you go to the nearest police station, file a report, and they'll give you instructions on that, right? But this person was unhappy, wrote about it. The other examples too. Loud construction going on, send a police, right? Send someone. It's again a 311 issue, more administrative issue. But people get upset, they complain. They have a lot of examples like that I will show. So this is the phenomenon I'm talking about. People dialing 911, getting upset, and the call taker says, sorry, I cannot send a cop, or I cannot send an ambulance because it's not a serious incident, right? So the research setting, let's call it, it's in a major city in the US. They get around 6 million calls. Let's call it Delta City, a pseudonym. And the organization I study, the main one is Delta City's Emergency Management Organization, or DEMO for short, and their police department too. So that's my main site. I also traveled around to see how prevalent this issue is. Is it only within that particular center, or is it a much more common issue? Looks like it is. So, but my focus for today's talk is going to be mainly on my main site, Delta City. The data sources, as I said, mainly observations. I sat next to a call taker, listened to the calls, see how they behaved, how they categorized the calls essentially, before and after a major social media incident. And I'll talk about them too. I also had access to, they have call logs. So whenever you dial 911, there's essentially, every call gets recorded. And you could, how the call taker categorized the call, whether it was a serious emergency or not, what kind of priority level they assign. All of them are as a part of that call log. It's a repeated cross-section data. So I had access to that too for multiple years to see how the call taker's behavior has changed. It's almost like a trace data. You could see, have they categorizing differently? Are they assigning more priority level or not? So that was an important data source. In addition, I actually scraped the Twitter feeds. When people actually, they hashtag or they add this particular organization, add demo. So I was able to scrape those and see, essentially collect data around that, right? So that's the data. Let me talk a bit more about what this organization does. What do the call takers do? So the call takers, as I said, they are the frontline workers. They collect the call. They ask a series of questions if you dial 911 to first determine what type of incident is it, right? Is it a police, fire, EMS incident? And then to determine, is it really a 911 level emergency? Is it that serious? Because there are only so many officers, so many cops, so many ambulances. So they decide that they have a lot of discretion in determining which call is an emergency, which one is not. And then once they decide that, okay, this call is a 911 level emergency, then they try to categorize it, assign a priority level, and then send it to the second sort of role in this process. These are the dispatchers. The dispatchers are the one who determine who is the nearest first responder, who is the nearest cop or EMT, and they will sort of send them and then basically coordinate, right? So two important points I want to note in this process is, one, the call takers have discretion, right? Although there are like protocols and policies, there's always some gap to determine what is an actual emergency. So they have discretion in determining, okay, based on the information I collected, based on my training, this call is not an emergency. And they will tell that to the caller too, right? The second kind of point is, and this is a multi-stage process. At least there are, three roles, right? The call takers, the dispatchers, and the EMTs, and the first responders. So these two actually play an important role too on some of the things I'm going to describe. So any questions so far on, the setting or any kind of, yes?
Yeah, so just to clarify, like when looking at this graph, if you were calling in, let's say, emergency or fire emergency, would you theoretically go through 3 different people as you go through the police side call taker, the fire medical, the fire side call taker, and the fire dispatch unit? Yeah. Or are some of those invisible to the caller?
Yeah, you only talk to the frontline worker, okay, right? So it's only to the call taker. And then depending on what they decide, then they can send it out or not send it out.
Okay, but those being sent out would not be transferring the call.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, awesome. Great. So I'm not going to go too much into the data analysis, but I want to talk about my unit, right? What did I measure? What are the things that I observed to essentially see if there is increased accountability or not? So the main thing I measured was, how do the call takers answer the calls? There are certain ways they answer the caller, right? They will first let them talk, make sure that their panic is reduced, and then ask questions. And then they determine how to categorize the call, right? Is it an emergency or not? What priority level? So that's my one main unit. The other unit was, because of the actions of the call takers, the frontline professionals, how did that impact the practices of other people in the chain, right? The police officers, the dispatchers. Do their actions in response to social media scrutiny actually make the life difficult for others, right? So that was my second unit. I'll show some evidence on both of these, right? So let me step back a bit and talk about what do the call takers do, right? I gave some general idea, but there are actually specific guidelines and trainings on what their role is, what their mandate is, right? So one of their important mandate is to answer the calls in a empathetic tone, engaged manner, because the people who are calling, they are probably facing the worst day of their life, at least according to them, right? So you have to respect that. You have to sort of calm them down before asking a bunch of questions. So that's their first kind of mandate. Treat the callers respectfully. And then the second is, you still have to do your job. Your job is essentially a triage kind of role. You have to answer questions. You have to essentially categorize the call properly. So these are the two mandates. And sometimes they conflict, as you could see. There could be people who could go on, and they might not give the correct information. Or there might be others who get really upset when the call taker says, sorry, I cannot send a cop or an ambulance for you, right? So as this person says, this is sort of part of their manual. They need to excel at calming people who are frightened, panicky, or upset. They also have to solicit information from the callers to accurately determine the gravity of the incident, right? So sometimes there's conflict. So what are some of the internal practices, accountability practices that this organization has to make sure that the callers are doing the job, that they are accountable for their actions? So there are some practices. The most important one is called call monitoring. So in the organization, there'll be every shift there are 6 or 7 supervisors now, whose job is to secretly listen to the call takers. Every month, they have to listen to them twice. So to essentially assess how are they taking the call, are they categorizing it properly or not. And then every month they give feedback, private feedback to the call takers that you did this well, you didn't do this well. And there are some consequences if they actually screw up multiple times, right? So that's one practice, an important one to enforce accountability internally. And it is not that this practice was perfect, right? There were actually sometimes there were mistakes, but by and large, this was effective in communicating back to the call takers on how they are doing, what they need to improve or not, right? So this private feedback within the organization that have been set up and have been around for years, it's more or less it works, right? Now enter social media, right? Things become a lot more complicated when people can use social media to scrutinize. And this is especially so when there is increased noise and information. And by that, what I mean is now people, the advent of smartphones, mobile phones, the kind of calls that these centers get have also changed quite a bit. What my participants call, it's not my term, what they call as BS calls, essentially. I'll show some examples. This is one. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the early stages, people called to complain that run out of toilet papers, and they think that's a legitimate emergency. Probably it is for them. There are many other examples. People call when their refrigerator is not working or when their kitchen sink is blocked, and they think that's an emergency that demands a response from the city. And if the call taker says no, they get very angry. They get very upset about that, right? And I mean, these looks like funny examples, but the broader kind of undercurrent is almost the lack or the collapse of community, at least in the US cities, right? If my kitchen sink is blocked or something happens, I'd probably knock the door of my neighbor, right? Ask for help. But there are a lot of people dependent on the city or some kind of government services, right? And it was fine to a certain extent. The call takers would give some examples, some kind of help, right? And say that, sorry, we cannot send an ambulance or a paramedic for it. It's not really an emergency. But now again, enter social media, right? Now people could actually name and shame the call takers. Sometimes all the outgoing calls could be recorded and they post portions of the call, so forth. Let me give one example to essentially highlight this, right? So the blue is the call taker, and the red is the caller. So the call taker says, this is 911, this is Operator Morgan, what is your emergency? They had to actually tell their last name for accountability reasons. The caller says, I don't know what happened really, but I think a bee stung my kid and she's crying. You said a bee, ma'am, yes, a bee. And then she asks a bunch of questions, protocol questions on, are there any swellings or marks you could notice? Not that I could see, but she's still crying. Again, a set of questions. Are there any allergies she developed? No. The mom answers that, no, I don't see anything. Then the call taker, after asking those questions, says, ma'am, we cannot dispatch for this. Please apply some ice where the bee had stung her and keep it for a few minutes. The caller goes, you said ice in a very stern tone. Yes, ma'am. A few seconds of silence on the other end, and then a barrage of swear words directed at the call taker saying, I know to apply ice, I don't need to call you people for it. I essentially want a paramedic or an EMT in my desk, and you're not sending it out. So she's very upset by that. But she didn't stop there shouting at the callers, right? The call taker. She went to social media, she wrote a blog about this incident, and then she tweeted about this, tweet storm. There she said, oh, my 6-year-old developed an allergy. And she answered that, no, there was no allergy, right? And she was very upset by this whole incident. And again, from the mom's perspective, perhaps she thinks it's an emergency, and I'm not sort of discounting that. But from the organizational perspective, they cannot dispatch an ambulance for this. There are only so many ambulances, right? The interesting part here is you would expect others coming in and correcting this, right? The social media users, the Twitter users. And I've looked at the retweets and what the comments. Some of them, yes, they said, no, this is not an emergency. Many others actually called names, essentially calling out the call taker saying, she's just a bureaucratic paper pusher, she doesn't care, she's not really worried about your kid, she's a waste of taxpayers' money, and so forth, right? So as you could see, from the perspective of the caller, they have a different kind of definition, expectations of what an emergency is, what a 911 level emergency is, which kind of doesn't match with the organizational definitions, right? And because others kind of also pile on to this incident, it creates this conundrum for the organization. What should they do now? Should they sort of send this out, or should they kind of, stop and push back against the people who complain? And they tried that. They actually started a Twitter account and tried to respond to such incidents. And what do you think happened in those cases where they tried to push back, respond to incidents such as this, saying, no, this is not really an emergency? Any guesses? What happened when the organization tried to push back against this?
They just made things worse.
Exactly, right? Made things work. People said, oh, you're just gaslighting, you're obfuscating the whole thing, you're not doing your job properly, and then you're blaming us, right? So essentially, that's what, again, it's not that everybody did that. By and large, a lot of people, the vocal people did this, and this created a problem for organization. I can show many such examples, right, where people getting upset, going to social media, and then, complaining, and others kind of piling on to this, and so forth, right? So this is all fine insofar as the organization could say, we're not going to do anything about it, right? We're just going to go about doing the job. But given, again, the public visible nature of such acts of scrutiny, what essentially happens is, at some point, the organization had to respond, publicly signal that they're doing something about it. So I'll sort of explain what happened next couple of slides, where this particular graph shows the x-axis is a week since a major scandal broke out, right? I'll talk about what that scandal was. The y-axis, the average percentage of calls that are categorized by the call takers, by and large, as a valid 911 level emergency, right? So the data goes back almost 4 years. And as you could see, the average percentage kind of wavers around 55 to 60%, right? That was 50 to 60%. So if you get 100 calls per year, 50 of them are actually categorized as real emergencies. And that baseline, you could argue, is there a right baseline or not? But based on, again, my own observations, listening to these calls, by and large, they get this right. They're always on the side of caution. So even if they think that, okay, looks like this might potentially become an emergency, they will still send out an officer or a cop or an ambulance, right? So 55, 60% is the baseline. And then the orange dots you see, these are, each one is around 20 minor incidents of social media scrutiny, right? So that happened, it happened for almost a year, these minor incidents of scrutiny, right? At one point, there was a major incident. The red dot you see was a major incident. And I can't go too much into the details of the incident, but essentially it was, there was a mistaken identity of a perpetrator and a victim of an emergency, of an incident. It was the police officers of this particular department, they mistook who the victim was and who the perpetrator was. And that led to essentially a gunshot. And the victim was, unfortunately, was wounded, right? And the mistake was actually the police officer who was on the scene, who didn't actually listen to the information provided by the call takers and the dispatchers. But because is the 911 organization that got scandalized, all the orange dots you see, who got exposed on social media a lot, right? The organizations, the 911 centers, directors, they had to sort of visibly signal something that they are doing to essentially calm the public's passions, right? At the time, the public were on social media, they were like, you folks screwed up, you didn't collect enough information. But the call record showed that the call taker asked information about the victim, the perpetrator, the dress, the color of the dress she's wearing, right? But it was not listened properly by the police. So a couple of police officers got suspended, but one call taker and a dispatcher associated with this incident too got suspended, despite it's not their fault. And there was information to push back to, right? So I hope this sort of the information is clear, right? The organization, the organization had information on what kind of questions the call takers asked. Did they do their job properly or not? Did they categorize it correctly or not, right? But despite all of that, despite the ability to push back, the director of the center decided that they can't do it. because if they push back, there's going to be a lot more flack. And the city hall was actually coming hard on this organization. So for them, the easy thing to do is a visible signal that we're doing something, we're taking your concerns seriously, and essentially suspend a call taker and a dispatcher who was associated with that incident, right? So that was the major part. And then after that, you could see this big spike, right? This big spike is essentially from that incident of the suspension, the average percentage of calls moved from around 52% to 78%, right? Almost quite a big jump. It eventually came down, but it reached a new normal, around like 60%, yes.
Do you know, was there any analysis done on this? Did the number of calls remain roughly the same, or is there any kind of like suggestion that people might have been less likely to call if they were afraid of an incident?
That's great. So the calls for the last 4-year period it increased, but not much after the scandal, right? The calls like more or less remain the same. And I kind of talk about those alternative explanations too, right? So is it the suspension that triggered this and not the social media incident? Tough to say, but there were other suspension incidents. This is a very much a 3 strikes and out kind of organization, right? If you screw up multiple times, you will get suspended. So there were prior incidents of suspensions, and you don't see a similar kind of spike. People are still trying to do their job properly, right? There was also a suspension related to a mainstream media scandal, right? There was an investigative reporter who complained about the center, that people are doing overtime a lot. And there too, even though it's not the fault of the people who are doing overtime, they're short-staffed. The director of the center, again, suspended a couple of people, right? Saying that, oh, we can't overtime. You have to be like, you're sort of taking advantage of overtime and getting paid a lot more, right? So that was this, the circle you see, the mainstream scandal, and then a suspension that followed that. And here too, you don't see a huge spike, right? So the argument I'm trying to build is, it's not like the unfairness of the bureaucracy that made the call takers become very self-protective, the spike you see, right? You don't see a similar spike after that first suspension, after the mainstream news media scandal. So they are, in some sense, developed tolerance for bureaucratic, misbehavior, right? We could sort of all kind of relate to it, right? We might be upset with universities' policies, and we almost have developed some kind of tolerance for that. We try to navigate it. But if the students of our clients behave, they sort of write nasty comments on our, student evaluations, and especially when they're public on sites like Rate My Professor, then the relationship changed. The relationship with our work changes. And in fact, there are some studies showing that the minute clients, like students, complain on public platforms like Rate My Professor, the syllabus of the professors on the following year becomes a lot more diluted. There is grade inflation after that. So there is something to do with the relation with the client as opposed to just bureaucratic punishment, right? Of course, the bureaucracy plays a second-order role in this. They could have protected them, right? But they were unable to. They still chose suspension. So that's the argument I'm trying to build here. It is, what does social media do in these circumstances? It allows the clients who you interact with, the people who you think you're trying to help as a frontline professional, it gives a sense that they have turned against us, right? They become mean, they've turned against us, and then they're going on social media and complaining without any attempt to understand the nature of our work, right? So any questions on this? Okay. So as this particular call taker says, nobody likes to do this, categorizing more incoming calls as emergencies, because they understand the consequences, right? But nobody likes this either. Look at what by they mean the public, the clients, writing about us. It's just painful. This is a stressful job, but this is not a way to treat us, right? So that's the first. Likewise, this particular call taker says, I don't feel like coming to work anymore. I feel no connection with any of this. People in this town have become so entitled, especially the ones addicted to social media. They don't really want answers. They just want heads to roll, like those cheering bloodthirsty mob on Gladiator, right? Very powerful quote. But essentially, again, I was very puzzled by this reaction on why they're so upset with the clients, as opposed to the bureaucracy, the senior management, who were punishing them. But my sense was this was a lot more impactful, emotional for them, right? We signed into this job to help the callers, save their lives, essentially. And we can tolerate any kind of bureaucratic misbehavior or bureaucratic punishments. But if the clients also are like behaving in a very mean way, then I'm just going to throw the towel and do the stuff that makes me protected, that makes me very self-protective. Right? So that's the first kind of thing that happened. This person Sue says, when I joined demo, I was warned that one should develop a thick skin to survive in this job. Callers can get mean and abusive. I can take that. I know they're having a bad day. That's part of their training, right? You have to calm down the callers. But going to social media, blaming us for doing our job, that is something else. Next time I'll be more careful. By that, what they mean is, not I'll categorize the calls properly, but that I will just categorize everything as, or most things as a 911 emergency, right? So that's the first. Then you might ask, okay, what role does hierarchy plays, especially the supervisors, right? As you might remember, the role of the supervisor is to monitor secretly and give feedback to the call takers every month. So it's not that the supervisors are blindsided by this process. They know what is going on. As the supervisor says, I know what is going on. That's my job to know. But I don't feel like calling them out on this. By this, I mean the call takers. As their boss, I want to make sure that they are safe and protected. So all I tell them is, don't screw it up, don't jinx it, because I care about them and I don't want some Twitter troll to abuse them, right? So their job, essentially, they are saying, I'm going to look the other side. You do whatever you want to avoid the next scandal, even if it actually impacts the organization, right? Even if it kind of locks up resources and so forth. So that's I don't know what happened. Okay, so that's why the hierarchy, you would expect it to come and correct things, but it didn't. This time, they just turned the other side, right? Then it didn't just stop there, right? Not just with the individuals trying to play it safe, being very self-protective. It created a whole kind of cascading consequence on others, on the dispatchers, on the police officers too. So they are like, I'm getting so many calls these days, I cannot handle, right? So this particular call taker says, I have come to terms with this. Just take the call, get the info, send it out. That's all there is to it. Ever try to rebooking a flight and listen to the bland voice on the other side of the line? I am just that person now. I'm sure she will never get into trouble. I'll be her, answer the callers the way she does. Essentially saying, whatever they want, I'm going to give them. If they want a cop, I'm going to give that to them, right? There is nothing more to it, right? So this, as I said, creates this cascading set of consequence to the work of the dispatchers. Now the dispatchers have to handle so many calls that are categorized from 52% to 78, 80% of calls, right? So they feel like their relation with the callers are strained. And likewise, the relation between the dispatchers and the police officers, so they are the ones who interact with the police officers, right? That also got really strained. Officers felt, I feel like a call chaser. I'm getting sent on all these BS calls, and I'm not in this job. I didn't sign up for this job to do this, right? So across the chain, there's this strained relation. But the big so what is essentially the response time for even serious emergencies have increased. As you could imagine, if the BS calls, the low-level calls are categorized, and you could only dispatch on the order it comes. So the higher priority calls have to wait longer. Ambulances, or say, think of a cardiac arrest, right? You only have so many ambulances at that point. So the higher priority emergency, there's almost a 36% increase on that year for the response time for higher priorities emergencies. And the even more broader consequence is that, and especially now, but even at the time, there were a lot of initiatives to rethink the function of the police, unbundle the functions of the police, and asking questions like, should we even send police officers to calls about mental health issues or drug abuse issues? Is that the job of a police officer? Are they even capable of handling that? Or should it be sent to social workers or mental health workers, right? Now the conversation is even more strong. But if the public, or at least certain portions of the public, demands that they want, and if the organization, like the demo, allows that to be possible, it's very difficult to implement these broader initiatives. You cannot really unbundle or defund the police, given the kind of conflicting pressures the public is facing on these organizations. So this particular initiative, there was some attempt to sort of rethink the function of the police. They were not able to do it because the officers are so overloaded. They have always been on calls after calls. So very difficult for them to attend these, right? So that's the broader consequence on difficult to implement police change initiatives, police accountability initiatives, because of the demand from the public, right? And more broadly, now, what is the definition of a 911 emergency? Is there a boundary? Could we think of what is and what is not? Of course, there is an organizational definition, right? Some criteria to determine. But now, everything, as this person says, a manager of this organization. I don't know what an emergency is these days. Like, seriously, what is it? There used to be a definition, what a 911 emergency is, what is a 311 emergency. But now everything is an emergency to the people. They want to be serviced right away. Now, it is like they're calling for an Uber, and they want it right now. Uber for everything, right? Again, it's not all the public, right? There's a portion of the public who are doing this, going to social media and complaining. But the perceptions it creates is the public wants to be serviced right now. Our hands are tied, essentially, right? So any questions so far before I kind of talk about the broader? Yeah. Yes?
I saw that you had people that were worried about what was being said about them on Twitter. Did you talk to people that weren't using any of those platforms, and did you see a difference in their perspective of it?
The call takers, you mean? Many of them didn't have a Twitter account. It was actually the organization, after these repeated scandals or repeated incidents, the City Hall asked them to set up a unit to monitor the Twitter feeds. And if some call taker is named, the job of that particular unit, the social media monitoring unit, is to tell them that this has happened, just you better be aware of it, right? So they've been informed about it. At some point, they stopped informing them. But even if they don't individually have an account or monitor, the news spreads, right? Someone else would say, I got called out on social media for no wrong of mine. So therefore, together, they sort of chat about it during the breaks. And the collective spike you saw was a result of those kind of informal conversations. Yes? Yeah.
To what extent does organizational action, like the extreme cases of suspending call workers, to what extent does that actually affect the public's impression? Because you mentioned that the number of calls didn't actually change. Are there any other measurable effects?
So the complaints on Twitter, especially after for the next few days for the next week, has at least calmed down a bit, right? It again started for a different issue, but that was the immediate consequence. The number of times they got hashtagged, or they got called out, that reduced. It's almost like I got what I want, or almost you're taking my concern seriously, and therefore I will sort of stop complaining on. So that happened on Twitter, essentially. Other questions? Okay, great. So I'll sort of summarize, right? I started with asking, when does social media scrutiny could improve versus obscure or worsen accountability? And improve, I've given some examples, right? Me Too example. This is a good example on when social media scrutiny could worsen or even obscure accountability, when it publicly challenges established definitions, right? And again, as I said, sometimes it could be good to challenge established definitions, but not always, right? There's some thought behind defining what a 911 emergency is, depending on the resources the city had, depending on how many cops and ambulances. Now, if everybody complains that there's no channel to push back, at least in the current state of things, it actually leads to worse outcome. So this is sort of the model I talk about, this vicious cycle, right? Like public complaints on social media, and then at some point the organization has to act, publicly signal that they are doing something. They cannot push back. If they push back, they say, you're just gaslighting us, or you're just obfuscating it, right? And the pushback, the easy action for them is suspending people or doing some punitive action on the person who's the lowest power in the organization, in this case, the call taker, right? That's the easiest for them to do, and almost like they're forced to do in some sense, structurally. And that creates this set of downstream consequences. The call takers becoming very risk-averse, very self-protective. They are like, I'm not going to do my job properly because I'm getting exposed. And that creates downstream consequences, more resources getting locked up. And even more broadly, you're sending officers unnecessarily to incidents that they shouldn't be there, and therefore which has the potential to even escalate, right? So why should an officer be there for like somebody playing loud music, right? There are other ways to address those concerns. There are even other mechanisms, like administrative services, 311 is there, right? But the public wants more. And that in turn creates this vicious cycle where people are not even sure what they're accountable for. As this person says, what exactly am I supposed to do? And how am I assessed? It used to be very clear to me on what makes for a good call taker. What's the proper way to answer calls, collect the information on whether it's a real emergency, and politely rejects the ones that are not. Right now, it is confusing. The supervisors used to give us clear feedback, what I did well, what I didn't do well, what I should improve. They stopped doing that. We are not sure what is the right way to do our job, right? So essentially, we're unclear about what they're accountable for, what is the criteria they're held accountable towards, and when they're held accountable, and who they're accountable for too, right? Before it's the supervisors and the organization at large. Now they are unclear, the call takers are unclear. So this is the last slide. So what are the broader takeaways, right? Social media scrutiny of low-powered workers, such as the 911 call takers, it actually creates this glass cage for them, right? They're constantly visible to the outside world. And therefore, they have to almost like perform, orchestrate their practices in a certain way that they are not exposed, or at least they are not like criticized in an unfair manner. Again, it's rational from their perspective to do so, but it produces all these downstream consequences, right? So even more broadly, scrutiny as a spectacle that social media allows to do that, right? It create these big spectacles, and spectacles not necessarily are bad. Me Too, in some sense, was a spectacle, right? A lot of issues, a lot of conversation. The societal discourse for the first few weeks was around that, and it created a positive change because it disseminated this pockets of private information to common knowledge, and therefore people who are associated with like folks like Harvey Weinstein, they had to take some public actions. Whereas in other cases, such as the example I gave, scrutiny as a spectacle could disrupt the meaning and definition of a particular phenomenon. In this case, it is what is the meaning, what is the boundary of emergency, right? And given there is very less avenue for people to push back, the organizations to push back, these new definitions become the norm, right? Even though there are not much resources at the city level to address those. And that creates this vicious cycle, this obscure accountability. People are unclear that who they're accountable for what purposes. And therefore, there are like some implications. Would love your thoughts on, the current way we design technology, such as Twitter, it is designed to create these spectacles, right? So why is there a retweet button on the home page of Twitter, right? If you see a tweet, you could retweet it in an instance, right? Even though you don't even read it fully. So could we think of different ways to design those technologies? Maybe you should sort of click on it, and maybe there is a threshold. Many people retweet it, only then it should be shared widely. There are other options to rethink technology design that doesn't create these wide spectacles in an unfair manner. And for organizations, the implication is that perhaps there should be some avenues to push back, at least privately, to take down a particular post, or if someone is named and shamed in an unfair manner, the organizational managers should have some avenues to do that, and the social media platforms should provide those avenues to push back, right? So, but I would love your thoughts on how this could translate to technology design, where, the technology is designed for more user engagement and create these, unintendedly it creates these spectacles, which doesn't help at some level for people like the 911 call takers. So what are other avenues we could think about? So that's sort of the open question I have for you folks. With that, thank you again. Thanks for your time.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions and feedback.
Sure.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I sort of, on that subject of like technology design and Twitter specifically, it seemed like in the example of the bee, right? The person who posted on Twitter almost sort of was lying or not being super, transparent. Like she was biased in the way that she reported what happened. She said, things that weren't necessarily true about the interaction that they had. And so I know Twitter right now is testing something where if you go to retweet an article or a meme or something that's like that they consider fake news, they've got
took that back, right? Now I think you could retweet it even though you haven't read it.
And I know recently they've been testing labels on things from community members. So if you see something that's fake, there will be a little label under it that says, for added context, users have said this isn't representative or something like that. So I'm just sort of, my thought was, because people are reporting these incidents in ways that might not be fully honest, if maybe you think it might help to have Twitter in any interaction with, police or a 911 dispatcher or something like that, for them to just put a little label on it that says something like, remember, this is just this person's experience, or remember to take both sides into account or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, they tried it not through labels, but just commenting on this, but that actually backfired, right? The people were like, no, like, we believe the account of the people who, according to the Twitter users, are the most low-powered, but not necessarily the case objectively, right? Sometimes they are, as you said, not presenting the whole information. But would love to know, what kind of interventions one could do from the design side to avoid these. People talk about fake news, but how to control fake news, but this is not fake news, or maybe it is, but there's some kind of, some kind of threshold one should have to name and shame someone or post the videos or like their voices, right? So what kind of threshold, what kind of mechanisms?
So you have these two criteria. One is where it's taking private knowledge and turning it into common knowledge. That improves. And the other one is if it's disrupting this definition and meaning of the phenomenon, which harms. Many situations are not cut and clear one or the other. When there's this, and when they are engaging both, does your theory have a prediction about which of the outcomes will dominate?
That's a great question. That's something I've been thinking about. There could be instances where things are like made common knowledge, which also challenges the definition of the situation, right? I don't have a strong prediction on what would happen in those circumstances. My sense is if those definitions actually are an improvement over what existed before, perhaps that's a good thing, right? Say, maybe in a medical emergency case, they have like undercategorized certain incidents as not serious emergencies. And if people push back and say, no, you should consider these incidents too as a serious emergency, then perhaps it's good. But by and large, what I find is it's people's own impressions about almost an entitled impression on I need help, or I just need, whatever my definition of the situation is, that's what you should accept that without any challenge. Then it actually worsens things, right? Great. Awesome.
Do you know?
Sure.
Do you know if there's any scholarship that's looked at the interactions between users and frontline workers in retail around masking requirements in
Interesting.
industry?
There are some work. I don't think it was very extensive, but there's some interview-based studies on how the retail workers reacted when someone walked in without a mask and they try to push back. And it's typically like, they get shouted at. But it's actually in those circumstances, it's the workers who take videos of those people who don't wear a mask, right? So not the other way around. But there's some work I'm happy to share.
All right. Then
All right,
let's
thank
thank
you.
our speaker.
Thank you.